The top Chinese official now says Beijing has agreed to extend its tariff truce with the U.S.
The growing trade. Tug of war. The simmering trade tensions between the U.S. and China have reached a new crossroads. Earlier this year, Donald Trump's trade team, backed by the full force of his America First strategy, sat down with Chinese officials in Stockholm, expecting momentum from recent trade wins with Japan and the European Union to continue. The strategy of bilateral pressure and reciprocal tariffs had proved effective, and the expectation was that China would fall in line, much as Europe and Japan had. However, what they faced was far more nuanced than a simple yes or no answer. China, instead of resisting outright or issuing dramatic threats, chose a more calculated approach. Rather than storming out of negotiations, Beijing chose to sit at the table and engage, albeit with deliberate and strategic restraint. They weren't outright rejecting Trump's demands, but were adopting a strategy of delay, offering subtle concessions while defending their long-term economic position. This was no retreat. It was a carefully considered postponement. The talks centered on several key issues: China's imports of Iranian and Russian oil, its commitment to buying more American goods, and reducing overcapacity in sectors like steel and electric vehicles. Washington came armed with a list of demands, and while Beijing did make some small gestures, such as lifting restrictions on rare earth magnet exports to U.S. firms, they did not give much ground in terms of the larger structural changes that Trump had hoped for. Instead, China's response was a mix of cooperation on the margins, but no commitment to broader economic restructuring on the timeline Washington was hoping for. On oil, China's position was firm. They acknowledged their ongoing trade with Russia and Iran, but made it clear that they were willing to pay the price for this. Chinese officials signaled that they were prepared to absorb tariffs as high as 100%, an acknowledgement of the reality of U.S. sanctions, but also a way to frame their trade with these nations as a matter of sovereignty. In essence, China was playing a long game, one that tested whether the pressure tactics that had worked on others would hold up against their resilience. What was evident in these talks was the stark difference in approach between Washington and Beijing. The U.S. was pushing for quick, tangible results, with the looming deadline of August 12th, when the tariff truce was set to expire. On the other hand, China was willing to extend the pause, but only as long as it didn't force them into a hasty restructuring of their economy. Instead of playing to the clock, Beijing was focusing on maintaining stability in their system, working within the confines of procedural cooperation, additional meetings, and the careful management of diplomatic space. Despite all of this, one powerful tool remained in China's arsenal: its dominance in the rare earth market. With over 90% of global refining capacity in its hands, China wields considerable leverage. The gesture to restore some of the rare earth magnet exports to U.S. firms was a goodwill move, but the underlying reality of China's control over this crucial supply chain remained unspoken but potent. As 2024 approached, China's position in this space would only grow more critical as the U.S. continued its efforts to strengthen defense and tech sectors reliant on these materials. For now, however, China's strategy remains one of strategic patience. The negotiations didn't end with a dramatic handshake or any big headlines. The pause continued, but the underlying message was clear. Beijing was willing to talk, but on its terms. Washington, while looking for fast results, had to contend with a power that was in no rush to concede on its own timetable. Canada's shift, a quiet move toward Beijing. As the U.S. continues its unpredictable tariff policies, Canada is quietly recalibrating its economic strategy. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford made an unexpected but telling remark in the middle of a volatile trade climate. If Trump's tariffs persist, Canada may look eastward to China. This wasn't just a casual statement, it was a signal, a shift in direction that could have profound implications for U.S.-Canada relations and the broader North American trade landscape. For years, the United States and Canada maintained one of the most stable trade relationships in the world. But now, tariffs imposed by the Trump administration on key sectors like steel, aluminum, and autos have begun to chip away at that foundation. The escalating uncertainty surrounding these tariffs is starting to affect Canadian businesses. Starting August 1st, the U.S. plans to impose a sweeping 35% tariff on all non-compliant Canadian goods, further destabilizing an already strained relationship. This move by the US is seen not just as a negotiation tactic, but as a threat that's pushing Canada toward exploring other options. The unpredictability of US tariffs, especially in the context of industries like steel, aluminum, and auto manufacturing, has made Canadian leaders reconsider their dependence on American trade. The tariffs are reshaping the trade foundation, and it's not just about the short-term damage. It's about the long-term strategic positioning. In a pointed response, Canada hasn't stood idle. Ottawa has escalated its own tariffs on U.S. steel and aluminum, mirroring the American moves, but more importantly, Canada has begun looking elsewhere for new partners. One of the most notable shifts has been a pivot toward China. Ontario in particular has deepened its trade with China, conducting over $43 billion in two-way trade according to provincial figures. While this trade has predominantly been in imports from China, the underlying message from Ford is unmistakable. If the U.S. keeps acting unpredictably, Canada will seek fair trade partnerships wherever they can find them, and that includes Beijing. China's growing influence in global trade has not gone unnoticed by Canadian leaders. Provincial leaders like Ford are aware that China is playing a long game of its own, offering trade deals that could help mitigate the impact of U.S. tariffs. For example, Canadian brewers are sourcing aluminum cans from China rather than the U.S. due to skyrocketing prices caused by Trump's tariffs. RBC's reports show that by June 2025, nearly 90% of Canadian exports to the U.S. were fully compliant with the USMCA, a clear defensive move to navigate around the shifting U.S. trade policies. However, it's not just about the economic impact of trade goods. The potential for Canada to pivot to China has broader strategic implications. China has long sought to expand its influence in the Western Hemisphere, and a deeper relationship with Canada would further solidify Beijing's foothold in North America, something Washington has long been wary of. If Canada continues to deepen its ties with China, it could deal a significant blow to U.S. manufacturing sectors that rely heavily on stable trade relationships with their northern neighbor. For the U.S., this shift could represent more than just a lost customer. If Canada, traditionally one of America's closest allies, begins to lean toward China, it could set a dangerous precedent for other nations feeling the pressure of Trump's tariffs. Canada's pivot, while still in the early stages, highlights the dangers of relying too heavily on tariffs to force compliance in global trade. The strategy of using economic isolation as a means of asserting dominance may be backfiring, pushing Canada and potentially other nations into the arms of China. The growing uncertainty around trade relationships is not limited to Canada. Throughout North America, business leaders and policymakers are beginning to realize that tariffs are no longer just a bargaining chip. They are creating significant economic volatility. And for businesses that rely on predictable trade agreements, this uncertainty is becoming a major problem. If Trump's tariff strategy continues to push Canada toward China, the U.S. may soon face a much larger challenge, one that extends beyond the trade war and into the realm of global strategic positioning. The global ramifications, a dangerous game of tariffs. As the tariff deadline looms on August 1st, President Trump is ramping up his trade war on a global scale, with potentially far-reaching consequences. His administration's recent threat to impose a 10% tariff on any nation that aligns with the BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has signaled a dramatic shift in how the U.S. views its trade relationships. While intended to isolate China and counter the growing influence of this economic bloc, the move risks alienating neutral nations and accelerating a global shift away from U.S. dominance in international trade. The BRICS group, representing a coalition of emerging markets and developing economies, has long positioned itself as a counterbalance to Western economic powers. Particularly the U.S. President Trump's aggressive stance towards this group underscores his administration's approach to international trade, one that leans heavily on tariffs, deadlines, and the application of pressure to achieve results. But in doing so, the administration risks pushing countries toward China, which is quietly expanding its influence and positioning itself as a responsible economic partner. Instead of retaliating with counter tariffs or escalating the situation further, China has opted for a more measured approach. Beijing has made it clear that it sees trade wars and tariffs as a dead end. The Chinese government has repeatedly emphasized that trade wars have no winners, and that protectionism only leads to greater global instability. In response to Trump's tactics, China has chosen diplomacy over confrontation, expanding its economic ties with nations in the BRICS group and beyond. The strategic goal behind this shift is clear. While the U.S. is busy imposing tariffs, China is building long-term partnerships. Over the past few months, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has held high-level meetings with European leaders in countries like France and Germany, focusing on green energy, multilateral cooperation, and strengthening trade outside of the U.S. dollar system. These moves, such as the Dabai nuclear plant project and solar energy installations in Greece, are part of Beijing's broader strategy to create more partners, not more enemies. China's diplomatic finesse is a stark contrast to Trump's approach. While the U.S. president uses tariffs as a blunt instrument to force compliance, Beijing has managed to strengthen its position by offering more nuanced economic partnerships. By reframing its trade negotiations as development-first initiatives, China is winning sympathy from the global South and presenting itself as a responsible economic power, in contrast to the chaos unleashed by U.S. protectionist policies. The danger for the U.S. lies in the uncertainty created by these escalating tariffs. Trump's threats are often vague, lacking clear definitions of what constitutes BRICS-aligned behavior, which leaves businesses and governments alike unsure of what actions might trigger new tariffs. This ambiguity is already creating hesitation in global markets, where long-term investments and business decisions depend on stable trade policies. The lack of clarity on these issues is detrimental, especially when countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa are trying to balance their economic relationships with both the U.S. and China. For these countries, Trump's hardline approach could force them to choose sides, and the risk is that they may ultimately lean toward Beijing, not Washington. Furthermore, Trump's tariffs may backfire by driving neutral countries closer to China's orbit. While the U.S. insists that it is protecting its economic interests, China's calm, diplomatic messaging is winning it allies, particularly in the developing world. By presenting itself as the adult in the room, China is gaining the upper hand in the court of international public opinion. This shift in global perception could have long-term consequences for the U.S., as countries may begin to question whether their economic future lies with Washington or with Beijing. As the trade truce with China nears its expiration date, the question remains: will the U.S. stick with its aggressive tariff-based approach, or will it seek a more diplomatic path forward? With the global economic landscape shifting, this decision could have far-reaching implications, not just for the U.S. and China, but for the entire global trading system. In this high-stakes game of tariffs, one thing is clear: isolation rather than strength may be the true risk.